Hi everyone, welcome to the next set of slides. You see this is Osteology Part 1 in your slide set. Osteology, if we do the terminology, osteo means bone and logy means study of. So the term osteology means the study of bone. We will be getting more into the physiology of bone in the second half of this course, but for now we're going to be doing the anatomy of bone. And most of you know it as its other name, the skeletal system. So that's what this set of slides is based on. So the function. Many of you have probably done some similar courses. I want you just to take a moment and think about some of the functions of bone. And I'm sure you can come up with some very common ones. First is protection. So we can use the spinal column as an example. It protects the spinal cord. Rib cage protects the lungs and the heart and so forth. It provides support, helps us keep our head up, it helps us stand on two legs, keeps us from falling over when we're sitting down, whatever that might be. Movement. Without bones, we couldn't move. We couldn't walk. We couldn't reach and grab something. We couldn't turn our heads and bend forward and so forth. Believe it or not, bone is an integral part of homeostasis of the storage of salts. So calcium salts, so forth, they're all stored here, and it's a requirement. It helps store them. Hemopoiesis, maybe a new term for a lot of you. Hemopoiesis is the creation of red blood cells. So the marrow that we find in bones actually plays a big role in replacing your red blood cells as they die off, maintaining homeostatic levels of the number of red blood cells you have in your body. So when we continue on and talk about biomechanics, so those are the functions they do. Biomechanically, there has to be a relationship between bones in order to have those movements occur. That is one of the roles of bone. Whenever we have two bones that come together and are somewhat connected, that is called a joint. Whenever we have two bones come together at a joint, this is where we have movement in the body. So we can say that wherever that movement is between those two bones, those bones are moving around an axis of action. There are three types of axis in the human body. There is uniaxial, biaxial, and multiaxial. Uniaxial, the joint is only moving in one plane. Biaxial, a joint moves in two planes. And multiaxial, a joint moves in multiple planes. Remember your planes: coronal, sagittal, and transverse. So a joint either moves in just one of those, in two of them, or in three of them. So we see here in the diagram, here is a uniaxial joint, the elbow. The true elbow joint only moves in flexion and extension. Whereas in the hip joint, it's a ball and socket, it moves in all three planes of the frontal, the sagittal, and the transverse if the leg's bent and moves around the hip. Ones that move in two directions would be the saddle joint here. It's a two-plane joint. So you see that knowing those planes comes in handy as to what movement the joint does. So we know the functions, and we now know that wherever two bones meet forms a joint, and those joints either move in one plane, uniaxial, two planes, biaxial, or more than two, multiaxial. What is bone? Well, bone is actually a matrix of mineral salts, basically a crystallized form of tricalcium phosphate called hydroxyapatite. Now, you know it is calcium, you know the disease state, osteoporosis, it's a loss of calcium, but basically the one that's involved in osteoporosis is not the hydroxyapatite, it is the calcium carbonate. What I want you to think about is that bone is a living tissue. It reacts to stress, it can grow, it has nerve tissue to it, it has blood vessels to it, so it is alive. If I were to apply an acid to bone and dissolved all the crystals of these salts that we find in bone, there would still be a framework of bone, but it would actually bend and be rubbery. Some of you may have actually done something like this in school, where you took an egg and you dropped it in vinegar, you let it sit for a number of days, you came back to it, and the egg was actually rubbery. Eggshell is exactly like that. It is a connective tissue frame that houses all kinds of crystals, which makes it hard. Our bone is exactly the same. So when we take the bone framework and we have crystallization that occurs, it makes that framework hard, and this is known as calcification or mineralization. Collagen fibers will also be found in here because we don't want bone absolutely hard. If we did have it that hard, it would become brittle, and any kind of force in it, it would just shatter. So collagen allows for a bit of pliability to bone so that it can react to stresses. And this is known as tensile strength. What tensile strength basically means is strength under tension and bend. So we see here in the pictures, this is sort of a cutaway of what bone looks like. You'll see we have solid bone here on the edges with this sponge toffee look here. This is a microscopic view of all this stuff here that looks like sponge toffee. When we look at the structure of bone, what we will do is we will use a long bone as the example. So that would be like your humerus, which is your upper arm bone, or your femur, which is your upper leg bone. And this makes it easiest to sort of describe the different structures within the context of a bone. The first is known as the diaphysis, or the shaft. And this is the long part. So if you think of that femur, you got some knobs on the top, you got some knobs on the bottom, you have this long shaft in between. That is known as the diaphysis. The two knobs at either end are known as the epiphysis. So we have the diaphysis, which is the shaft, the two epiphysis at either end. Then there is the metaphysis. And this is where the diaphysis shaft meets the knobby end, the epiphysis. In children who have growing bone, this area where the two meet is alive and has lots of cellular reproduction, division going on, and this is known medically as the epiphyseal plate. You probably know it as the growth plate. Some of you may have heard that term before. As we age and get older, our epiphyseal plates shut down and we don't grow anymore. So each bone has epiphyseal plates. Have epiphyseal plates, and they all shut down and stop at different times. There is a main blood supply to the bone. As I said, it is alive, and there's a hole in the midpoint of the diaphysis where an artery goes through. That hole is known as a nutrient foramen, and that's where the blood supply goes in. The two ends, the epiphyses, or the epiphyseal parts, are supplied by epiphyseal arteries. So we see here in the diagram, here in the middle is the shaft or the diaphysis. At the very ends are these two knobby areas. They are the epiphysis. And then the area between the diaphysis and the epiphysis on both ends represents the metaphysis. This is a picture of a growth plate. So this would be the metaphysis here with the epiphysis at the top, and this would be the end of the diaphysis. The reason I did this x-ray is to understand that the metaphysis is alive. It is not bone. So in an x-ray, it almost looks like we have an extra bone here at the knee. This is a knee. This is the tibia and the fibula. This is the kneecap. This is the end of the femur. We have a space here and a space here. In an adult bone, there wouldn't be any of these spaces. It would be solid, but this is the growth areas. Number 4 is the articular cartilage. So at either end in the knobs, at the epiphyses, this is where the bones will meet to form the joints. Bone against bone won't work. It'll grind away, it'll disappear, it'll be extremely painful, the patient wouldn't be able to move. So what the body has done is placed a shock-absorbing tissue called cartilage that covers the ends of those epiphyses to help with making it frictionless as the bones move. So the articular cartilage is called hyaline cartilage, and it covers the epiphysis, and this is where the bone meets bone to form the joint. Number 5 is we actually have a skin on the bone. And within the skin, this is where we find nerves, we find blood vessels help supply the bone and keep it alive and so forth. It is called the periosteum. The periosteum is a skin or membrane around the surface of the bone that is not covered by hyaline cartilage. So where we have hyaline cartilage, we do not have a periosteum. It's just the hyaline cartilage. The important thing to understand twofold is one is this skin does supply nerves and blood supply to the bone to some degree. But the second part is it is this tissue that muscles attach to. The tendons of muscles do not attach directly to the bone. They attach to the periosteum, and the periosteum is therefore attached to the bone. There are 2 layers to the periosteum, an outer layer that is fibrous and an inner layer that is called osteogenic. The outer layer is connective tissue that contains blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves. The inner layer, the reason it is called the osteogenic layer is because this is where bone replacement and growth occurs. And it contains elastic fibers, blood vessels, and different types of bone cells. So if a bone needs to be modeled and dissolved a bit, we have cells that can do that. If a bone just needs to be maintained, we have a cell that does that. If the bone needs to repair or remodel or regrow, we have bone cells that do that. So we see here in this diagram, this knobby end on both these bones here and here are the epiphysis. And where these 2 bones are going to meet, the body has placed articular cartilage where they'll meet, which provides shock absorption and some frictionless surface for them to move across each other. This is just a picture of a diaphysis that gives you a sense of what's going on in a bone, and it shows the 2 layers of the periosteum. The inner layer, remembering, was the osteogenic, and the outer layer was where we found the blood vessels, most of the blood vessels and nerves, known as the fibrotic layer or fibrous layer. The 6th structure of a bone is called the medullary cavity or the marrow cavity. It is the space within the shaft or the diaphysis. In adults, it contains a fatty yellow marrow, not a red marrow. In children, it can still contain the red marrow, and the red marrow is responsible for the production of red blood cells. Yellow marrow is what's left over. There is some blood vessels and nerves that run through there that help supply a little bit of the bone. The 7th is the endosteum. So we had the periosteum. From a terminology perspective, peri means around, so that is on the outside of the bone. The endosteum, endo means within or in, so this is a skin that lines the inside medullary cavity. And it contains something called osteoprogenitor cells, and these cells are ones that can become cells that make more bone. So we see here, we have the periosteum here, and we have the endosteum skin just slightly being pulled away here by a device that lines the inside medullary cavity, and then we have the medullary cavity here, the hole or the space between or within the shaft. There are 2 types of bone in the body, compact bone and spongy bone. I'm just going to go briefly through them. We'll get into them with much more depth in the second half of the semester. Compact bone is also known as dense bone. There's almost no spaces in it. From the naked eye, it looks like it's just a solid piece of bone. It is the external layer of all bones. So whether we're looking at the skull right under the skin, the diaphysis of the femur, the outside coating of the sternum, it's always compact bone. It is strong and helps provide support for strength. It also provides, in some ways, large areas for muscle attachment, and it is the bulk of what makes up the diaphysis. So we see it here microscopically. You really almost can't see any spaces in it, and from the naked eye, you certainly would just think of that as solid bone. Spongy bone is different. It looks a lot different under the microscope. It actually looks like sponge toffee. There's lots of air spaces. And between these air spaces are needle-like spicules, so think of spikes called trabeculae, and they intertwine all the way through. So imagine a bone that has an outer shell of compact bone, but inside is all spongy looking. Almost, I say, it looks like sponge toffee. If we were to look at a flat bone like the skull, we would see it would be like a sandwich. The outside layer and the inside layer of the skull plate would be compact bone, but between the two layers, sandwiched between the two, would be the spongy bone. So we see it here. This is actually a diagram of a real human bone that's been sliced along the coronal or frontal plane. And you'll see here in the diaphysis this really thick compact bone, but the epiphysis is almost entirely made up of spongy bone, except of course for this outer shell that would be compact bone, but you can see it's much, much thinner in the epiphysis than it is in the diaphysis. So, and this is sort of a microscopic view of what it looks like when we see it up close. We see also the inside of the medullary cavity. We do have some spongy bone there as well, which we see in this drawing. The placement of these spicules or these trabeculae just seems like they're random, like they're all over the place, but they're not. They're actually arranged in such a way to meet the demands of force that are placed on them when that bone is working, whether it be walking, running, moving the arm, whatever it may be. And what that does, what those patterns do is make the bone strong, but because of the air spaces, also make the bone light. The arteries that supply the bone marrow and the medullary cavity provide nutrients to the spongy bone. As I said, it's light, and the trabeculae do support and protect red bone marrow. We tend to find spongy bone in the hip bones, the back bones, and the ends of long bones. We do also find some in the sternum as well, and it's where we have the red marrow where this hemopoiesis occurs, or this red blood cell formation. So you'll see here, we have a diagram of, on the left here, of forces or vector forces. So this is the top of the femur of a leg. All these lines represent the lines of force that occur at any given time in a normal femur. And you will see that the trabeculae in the artist's rendition here follow these lines in such a way that they provide good strength, but because they're spongy with the air holes, they also make the bone a lot lighter, which makes it far easier for us, because if they were solid, we would have to have bigger muscles, stronger muscles in order to move around. Thanks for listening to the next slide.